Hi everyone, I just want to apologize in advance for the fact that in the video you're about to watch, I pretty much completely lost my composure about 20 times. So if you want to see me slowly lose my mind, the more we learn about the colossal direwolf situation, the people they capitulate to, and the people they involve in the company, have fun and enjoy this video! Hi everyone! I didn't want to make this video. So a couple of weeks ago we saw this really shocking and extremely exciting headline from Time magazine, who announced that the direwolf had been brought back from extinction, and for about 2 minutes I was the most excited human being alive. But then I read the article and was quite shocked by what it said. Now, when Colossal Biotechnologies announced that they were going to be reviving extinct animals, I think basically everyone else in the scientific community had assumed that they were going to be using the same sort of method that was previously used, albeit briefly, to de-extinct the Pyrenean ibex. That being that we thought what they were going to be doing was reconstructing the entire genome of the extinct animal using DNA from unfossilized, well-preserved remains. These we assumed would then be inserted into the egg cell of a related animal which had had its genome removed from that egg cell. The general consensus among all of the biologists I've talked to is that if the genome of the resultant new animal is not genetically indistinguishable from the original species, then you have not brought that species back from extinction. You just haven't. But unfortunately, if you want to bring back a direwolf, you have a huge problem, because direwolves died out over 10,000 years ago, and their DNA is very fragmentary. So, to resolve this, Colossal's team, led by renowned geneticist Dr. Beth Shapiro, sequenced everything that they could from the direwolf's genome, compared it with living canids, reassessed its known relationships, and decided that the best species to use as genome as a base to bring a direwolf back was a grey wolf, despite a fairly recent paper concluding that grey wolves and direwolves aren't actually all that closely related. But we'll get to that later. What Shapiro and co did was, through comparing the genome of the direwolf with the genome of the grey wolf, they decided which features of the genome differentiated direwolves from grey wolves, and then tweaked those features in the grey wolf genome so that the grey wolf genome was something that would result in an animal morphologically similar enough to a direwolf that it would theoretically probably function and potentially behave in the same way as a direwolf. Now, Colossal modified 14 genes in a grey wolf to express traits that were expressed in direwolves, making the grey wolf genome slightly closer to that of a direwolf. But that is 14 genes out of around 19,000 that make up the total wolf genome. To make matters even worse, literally no actual direwolf DNA was used at all in the genome of these new supposedly de-extincted direwolf pups. None. These animals are objectively far closer genetically to a grey wolf than to a direwolf. I also want to point out that at no point prior to the announcement of this was a peer-reviewed paper on either direwolf genetics or on the de-extinction ever released. Colossal did not wait for their findings to be checked by independent experts before making this announcement. They just announced it, which is not how science is ever done, because this just allows you to make up anything. So, as you've probably seen, tons of scientists and virtually every prominent science communication YouTuber who has responded to this whole thing has done so in a manner that is not exactly flattering to Colossal. A key key issue here is that Colossal are using a phenotypic definition of a species, whereby, according to them, if a newly recreated species looks and acts like the species it's replacing, it's accurate to call them the same species. This is what Colossal said on their Reddit post, and Beth Shapiro has repeated this point across multiple videos. This completely ignores the fact that a huge portion of species that are being described today are what we would call cryptic species, that look and act very similar to known taxa, but which are quite different genetically due to prolonged isolation from parent populations, to the extent that they can't really be viewed as the same thing anymore. Science has really gone past the definition that Colossal are using thanks to genetics, which makes the fact that Colossal, a genetics company, are using a phenotypic definition of species all the more bizarre. Now, as for the classical species definition, we don't know if Colossal's dire wolves would produce fertile offspring with the extinct dire wolves, but we know that they certainly should be able to with grey wolves, because they are just slightly modified grey wolves. But if we go back to Colossal's definition, they want animals that look and act like the animal they're replacing, which creates a huge problem, because we have no idea how dire wolves acted. Do you see dire wolves running around that you could follow their behaviours, track their behaviours of? No! We have no idea what their social behaviours were like, how they interacted with other canids, how they interacted with their prey species. Nothing! We don't know how they behaved! Now, Colossal are making assumptions of how they behaved on the basis of modern extant canids, but modern extant canids display a wide array of behaviours. Colossal are seemingly assuming that dire wolves behaved much like grey wolves, even though they're not all that closely related to grey wolves as far as canids go, and assuming to know how a species acts based on its closest relatives is extremely fraught. For example, these New Zealand southern ants are in the same subfamily as South American fire ants, and they look really similar, but they act very differently, and southern ants don't form rafts with their bodies over the water when a forest floor floods in the same way that fire ants do. If southern ants died out and you replaced them with fire ants, the ecosystem would probably greatly suffer for it. Even if you make something that looks like a dire wolf or a southern ant, it won't necessarily act like one of these animals and might not occupy the same role in its ecosystem as a result. So, whether we use a genetic definition or the definition that Colossal use, no, these animals are not dire wolves. They are a first step approximation of how a dire wolf might have been that I could potentially understand being an early step in the process towards de-extinction of dire wolves, but they're treating this as the end product, which means they're lying when they're saying they've completed the de-extinction of a dire wolf. And don't just take my word for it. In this article linked in the description, Dr. Jeremy Austin, the director of the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA, said, "That's not a dire wolf under any definition of a species ever. I don't think this represents de-extinction in any way, shape or form." He also said, "All Colossal have done is create a genetically engineered grey wolf that looks like something the company thinks a dire wolf might have looked like." Now, in that same article, Colossal's Dr. Beth Shapiro said, "I think the best definition of a species is if it looks like that species, is acting like that species, and is filling the same role as that species, then you've done it." But there's a huge problem with that. Namely, that dingoes, which are feral dogs introduced by Aboriginal Australians, look a lot like, in many ways act a lot like, and fill the niche left behind by thylacines in mainland Australia. In fact, thylacine skulls are extraordinarily similar to the skulls of dogs due to convergent evolution, To the extent that, at least according to some other YouTubers I've seen over the years, I can't actually find a reference to this, Oxford University supposedly used to use thylacine skulls and dog skulls when assessing their undergraduate students to work out if they could tell the difference, to see if they've been paying attention in class. So if we follow Beth Shapiro's definition, if we just draw stripes on a dingo, that makes it a thylacine. But that's clearly not how you define a species! This is nonsensical! And Colossal have really run with Beth Shapiro's bizarre, overwhelmingly unpopular definition for what a species is, and repeatedly claimed on social media that they have brought back a direwolf, despite virtually every geneticist, biologist, paleontologist, and science communicator who doesn't work for Colossal arguing that they haven't. You've probably already seen like 50 plus videos on Instagram from working scientists already arguing against them. I know I have! So, did Colossal Biosciences respond to these criticisms of their huge media announcement by politely conceding that different species definitions do exist, and or by changing their messaging to clarify that they hadn't actually brought back direwolves? No! They made a whole bunch of memes attacking the scientists and science communicators who disagree with them. That's how SciComm is done, right? With ad hom attacks on scientists and science communicators? Ah! Colossal CEO Ben Lamb even personally posted this really, frankly, kind of concerning meme calling every single person who disagrees with calling these animals direwolves a sheep. So if you're a biologist or a geneticist who prefers a genetic species concept to the morphological one that Colossal uses, you're apparently a sheep! Now, one of the memes that Colossal posted claimed that their upcoming paper publishing their work sequencing the direwolf's genome proves that direwolves and grey wolves actually are one another's closest relatives, which justified why they used grey wolves as their starting point. And here is Colossal's Director of Species Restoration, Sarah Ord, saying that Colossal chose the grey wolf to reverse engineer into a direwolf because it is the closest living relative of the direwolf.
So what you can do is you can map that to its closest living relative. So at Colossal, we're using the grey wolf.
So it sure would be embarrassing if their own preprint that they just released about direwolf genetics debunked their own claims that the grey wolf was the closest relative of a direwolf, wouldn't it? Oops! Well, the preprint, which I'd like to point out has not been peer-reviewed, and thus really should not have been released yet on an announcement like this, is interesting. I'd actually even call it good. But it contradicts everything that Shapiro and Colossal were saying about grey wolves being the closest relative of direwolves. What they found is that direwolves are descended from a hybridization event, whereby 2/3 of their DNA came from a canid closely related to grey wolves, coyotes, dholes, and black-backed jackals, whilst the remaining third came from a more primitive canid related to a number of South American species such as the maned wolf. On the basis of their own phylogenetic analysis, a black-backed jackal seems to be a fair bit more closely related than a grey wolf. So why didn't they use that as their starting point? Why did Colossal actively choose to go for a species that seems to be one of the least closely related in this small subset of canids? Was it just because they wanted to make it look like a grey wolf for aesthetic reasons? And or making it look more like the direwolves in Game of Thrones reasons? On the topic of Colossal's questionable science, some people that I've spoken to have questioned how Colossal were sure that the specimens they were sampling's DNA actually came from a direwolf and not a grey wolf, since their grasp on skeletal anatomy is... Look at this! Ah yes, my favourite bone, the Amadeuus. And who could forget the caudal bones, which of course are different from the tail bones, even though caudal literally means tail. And everyone's favourite bone, the dorsal? You know, dorsal literally just means top and doesn't refer to a specific bone, right? Why are you pointing at vertebral processes for that? Why are they pointing at the back of the knees for the kneecap? And why are they pointing at the sternum when they forgot to actually draw a sternum? There's actually a lot more problems with this diagram, so I recommend watching Joannosaurus's video on it. But there's an even bigger problem here. A problem that undercuts every single thing that Colossal have claimed about being an environmentalist company, doing genetic research for conservation and de-extinction processes. Namely, why is an environmentalist company supposedly doing conservation and de-extinction research for environmentalist reasons joking around with and uncritically promoting individuals who have had a devastating impact on our ability to tackle both the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis on Twitter? Here they are retweeting United States Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum. And the tweet that they are retweeting is shocking. Burgum says that thanks to Colossal's de-extinction of the direwolf, we can completely rethink the way we think about conservation and celebrate removing species from this list. He's basically saying we don't need to protect species anymore because now we can just pay Colossal to bring them back after we've wiped them out. And Colossal retweeted that! What the
Redacted.
So on the topic of people who apparently have the endorsement of Colossal, let's have a look at Doug Burgum's environmentalist record. Doug Burgum has, as noted by the REI Union, called for more oil and gas drilling on public land, reversed regulations on the fossil fuel industry to help tackle climate change, reduced accountability for mining companies against harming wildlife, is a supporter of the extremely environmentally damaging coal industry, and says we need more coal! He's also a supporter of the infamous Dakota Access Pipeline, and he has signed Secretary's Order 3420, which unbanned the leasing of oil and gas exploration on the US's continental shelf, which could cause horrific amounts of damage to the ecosystem and make climate change even worse. Burgum is also a supporter of deregulating red tape towards the fossil fuel industry, despite the fact that said red tape exists to protect the surrounding ecosystems and people around fossil fuel works, meaning that Burgum is effectively a supporter of making pollution worse and making it easier for companies to get away with poisoning the water supply. Burgum also signed Order 3422, which directs the Department of the Interior to take, and I quote, all necessary steps to unleash Alaska's abundant and largely untapped supply of natural resources, establishing a national fucking petroleum reserve in Alaska, and heavily sabotaging our ability to tackle both climate change and to protect Alaska's ecosystems from degradation. This man is devastating our ability to protect our planet's ecosystems, and Colossal is just retweeting him! I'd like to point out that Burgum is also an active participant in the Republican Party's genocidal policies against trans people. So yeah, great look for a progressive environmentalist company. But it gets worse. It gets so much worse. Here's Ben Lamb, the CEO of the company itself, who is openly a big fan of Elon Musk, regularly retweeting with Musk and engaging with him on Twitter. Here he is, saying that he will clone Elon a miniature mammoth. You know, Elon Musk, the Hitler-saluting open fascist who regularly retweets actual neo-Nazis, turned Twitter into a far-right hellscape, called empathy a weakness, called his very much alive trans daughter dead and killed by the woke mind virus, doxed climate researcher Ashley Thomas and accused her of having a fake job, resulting in her being bullied off LinkedIn. Oh, and by the way, she does have a real job. She researches ways of securing agriculture and infrastructure against extreme weather. Or, I say she does. I'd frankly be shocked if Elon's Doge hadn't fired her, because, yeah, Elon has had a devastating effect on humanitarian efforts, thanks to his shutting of USAID through Doge, and on protecting the environment. For example, thanks to Elon Musk and Doge, thousands of scientists conducting important research to help protect our planet or to keep people healthy have suddenly been fired. This man is destroying the lives of scientists and making it much, much harder to protect our ecosystems, and he is being actively retweeted by a supposedly science-focused environmentalist company. Literally not 2 weeks ago, Doge fired 880 workers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, the group responsible for a huge amount of weather and climate research, which now means it will be harder to predict severe weather events and tackle climate change. Elon is actively endangering millions of lives by firing these people. And Colossal are retweeting him. Thanks to Doge, over 1,000 workers at the National Park Service have been fired, and many conservation areas are now wildly understaffed. But hey, that's all good with Colossal. Despite all of these anti-conservation and anti-environmentalist actions, Colossal as a company has actively associated with Elon on social media, signaling their affiliation with the genocidal fascist. This is not something that makes any sense at all if Colossal is actually an environmentalist or conservationist company. Colossal have consistently retweeted right-wing voices who support their project and never once retweeted a single person left of center. Here they are also retweeting Joe Rogan, who Ben Lamb also did an interview with to promote his work. Joe Rogan, of course, has repeatedly platformed pseudoscientists. We talk about his platforming of climate change denial uncritically in my upcoming video on Jordan Peterson, and he has also been heavily involved in mainstreaming pseudo-archaeology, as discussed in Professor Dave Explains' recent video showing his showcasing of Graham Hancock and many of Graham Hancock's allies. This is not someone a science-focused company should be promoting the views of. Also worth noting that in Ben Lamb's discussion with Joe Rogan, Ben Lamb criticized the scientific community for wanting findings to be peer-reviewed before they're announced. As though that isn't like the basics of how science is published and has been for decades. Now, because everyone was criticizing him for his obvious right-wing bias, Colossal CEO Ben Lamb put out a statement on Twitter arguing that conservation work should transcend politics, that there are no red and blue species, and that conservation has been a shared ethos and goal transcending political divisions. But that makes no sense when only the Republican side is currently gutting our ability to conserve anything and erasing our ability to protect all of our planet's ecosystems from the climate crisis. And this is where things get really bad, because in the midst of a climate crisis, why is Colossal trying to bring back Ice Age creatures to a world that is getting less and less and less like the one they came from? Well, this is purely speculative, but I don't think Ken Lamb believes in the overwhelming evidence for anthropogenic climate change at all. Why? Look how he starts his video, which announced the direwolf de-extinction.
Everyone likes to talk about the climate crisis, but we are actually in a biodiversity crisis, and that's absolutely critical to our way of life.
Yep. Ben Lamb just contrasted climate change against the biodiversity crisis and said, but actually, we're in a biodiversity crisis. We are in a biodiversity crisis, that is undeniable, and it needs more attention. But why would you say you might have heard this, but actually this, if you aren't trying to downplay the first thing? The science on climate change and its devastating impacts on our planet and ecosystems and people should not be downplayed, nor as something that is debated on by scientists. We talk about the science and effects of climate change in both my old video on the UK Conservative Party's terrible climate policy and on my upcoming video about Jordan Peterson, which is mostly about his climate change denial, which I have been trying to finish for the past 6+ months. In any case, climate change denial is as absurd as flat Earth, and Ben Lamb consistently skirts around talking about it in his videos and in his company's papers. Which is concerning, considering that they are trying to revive species which evolved in a colder climate. Although I say revive, what I actually mean is create facsimiles using related animals. But hey, Ben Lamb is not the only person at the top of Colossal. At least the company's co-founder, John Church, a world-famous geneticist, he's great, isn't he? He totally isn't a huge fan of putting AI art in videos and giving talks on why we need to put the high CO2 emitting plagiarism-driven generative AI technologies into more and more biological research, right? 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 For fuck's sake. But hey, these deeply untrustworthy looking traps must have filled their company with conservationists, right? And surely they're taking advice from environmental scientists, right? Here we have a senior member of their advisory board. This is Irae Skipwith, who is the former director of Fish and Wildlife. And she has a whole page on Colossal's website which says that she is passionate and committed to wildlife, the environment, science, and sustainable development. She sounds really trustworthy. I mean, sure, she used to work for infamous environmentally devastating pollution hellscape company Mozart, but I'm sure she did a great job after that directing Fish and Wildlife. Oh! The Center for Biological Diversity stated, Irae Skipwith has been working in the Trump administration all along to end protections for billions of migratory birds, gut endangered species safeguards, and eviscerate national monuments. Skipwith will always put the interests of her old boss Monsanto and other polluters ahead of America's wildlife and help the most anti-environmental administration in history do even more damage. She even weakened protections for birds against being killed by oil and gas companies. And she scrapped protections for monarch butterflies despite them being recognized as endangered. And most ironically of all, she tried to lift federal protection for grey wolves, a move which the ESA said could devastate their populations, and which she justified by lying about a population rebound where it wasn't happening, as talked about in this article, which I've linked in the description. Colossal are actively taking advice from one of the most extreme anti-conservation individuals I have ever heard of, who seemingly wants endangered species to go extinct. The question is, why? Why would you involve someone like this unless you were trying to wipe things out so that you could be paid to bring them back? But hey, I'm sure that there aren't any other suspicious individuals on Colossal's team. Like, everyone else I'm sure is great, right? Oh look, it's infamous fraud and credit taker of other people's work, Forrest Galante. See this video for details, I can't be bothered to talk about him. That's great to see he's involved. That's just great. And then there's this investor who claims to work closely with Ben Lamb, who constantly retweets far-right individuals on Twitter and recently criticized Tim Walz for daring to criticize fascist Elmo Daddy. But I think I've gotten a little bit too political at the moment and not really talked enough about science, which is a bit painful because I'm supposed to be a science channel. So we need to acknowledge another problem with reviving direwolves. Even if these creatures truly could be considered direwolves, which they can't, but let's say that Colossal actually had purely cloned direwolves. The ecosystems which supported direwolves don't exist anymore. According to this recent study, the primary prey species for direwolves were flat-headed peccaries, which are extinct. The majority of prey species thought to have been targeted, such as camelids, Capromeric pronghorns, ground sloths, and western horses, are also extinct. What on earth are these animals supposed to eat if released into the wild if their main prey species are all extinct? But let's say that these animals, when reintroduced, do function effectively as an apex predator in the northern North American ecosystem. If they do, one of two things would happen. Either they would interbreed with grey wolves and impact the grey wolf's natural gene pool, or they will compete with grey wolves, further driving down their numbers and overall harming grey wolf conservation efforts. But there's a huge elephant in the room. And that is an elephant which is genuinely scary to talk about. And no, I am not talking about mammoths, even though Colossal's plan to bring back mammoths is their biggest story and is an entire video on its own. I've actually kind of already done a video about it, where I, Astrid Lundberg, and some other people had a chat with Harrison Duran about their plans to do so, but we're not talking about that. The real elephant in the room here is the technology that they've developed and its potential to be used in eugenics. When I and others were talking about the situation with Harrison on Discord the other day, he described Colossal's ability to successfully edit genes in a grey wolf to make them express direwolf genes as being actually more impressive than just cloning a direwolf. But when I saw Colossal's method, my response wasn't, "Wow, that's impressive." I felt horrified. I know this section is going to be quite opinion-based, but using this technology, geneticists now have the ability to select and enhance or change the expression of pretty much any trait exhibited by an animal, which could just be used to make designer pets. I mean, these direwolves are basically just designer puppies. Or, what feels almost inevitable, is that it could be used for eugenics research for billionaires who want designer baby perfect children. The fact is that, as mentioned earlier, Colossal are cozying up to Elon Musk, who has been pretty openly white supremacist online. I don't think anyone who's followed his Twitter would argue with that. And whose own trans daughter has revealed that Elon uses sex-selective IVF to ensure that he only has genetically male children. Musk is also obsessed with the idea of having as many offspring as possible, as he thinks that if he produces as many offspring as he can, his children are the most likely to save humanity, as discussed in this Guardian article. If Colossal have any plans to stop their technology from being misused by eugenicists or from billionaires like Musk with eugenicist-adjacent views, why haven't we heard about this from Colossal? And why are they courting favor with someone who consistently shouts the eugenics shout? Pandora's box has been opened with this technology. And instead of being responsible for the potentially devastating outcomes of their advances, Colossal are attacking scientists with memes.
Hi, Editing DJ here. I just want to point out that in the few days since this announcement was released, the IUCN SSC, which is the organization whose definition for de-extinction colossal are using, put out a statement noting the distinct genetic differences between direwolves and the animals that Colossal have created, and stated, and I quote, "The three animals produced by Colossal are not direwolves, nor are they proxies of the direwolf based on IUCN SSC guiding principles of extinct species for conservation benefit. First, there is no evidence that the genetically modified animals are phenotypically distinct from the grey wolf and phenotypically resemble the direwolf. Second, our knowledge of the behavior, phenotype, and ecology is inherently limited because the direwolf is extinct. Rapid advancements in gene editing could contribute to future conservation efforts as a useful addition to our conservation toolbox, but they should not be adopted as a panacea to the current biodiversity crisis. Suggesting that extinction can be reversed through technology risks undermining the urgency of conserving existing species and ecosystems. Relying on the notion that we can restore lost species through gene editing diverts attention from the most critical conservation goal, protecting the biodiversity and habits that currently sustain life on Earth."
So, in summary, Colossal are lying about having brought direwolves back by stretching the definition of a species beyond any practical usage. They are going out of their way to attack scientists on social media, and their leadership are actively going out of their way to promote the voices of fascists who could use their research for genetics and who actively oppose all of the conservation goals that the company claims to have, whilst the company also includes deeply anti-conservation individuals in its advisory board. I feel no ambiguity here on the basis of this evidence in saying that I strongly suspect that Colossal is a scam. And hey look, prominent science communicator Lindsay Nicole is out here making videos for them. I can't wait for her to say nothing at all about all of the far-right individuals involved in the company she's promoting, or the company's attacks on other science communicators. Oh look, she hasn't said anything to condemn that! I just want to end this rather unhinged rant/ramble with a final message to Lindsay Nicole, to Harrison Duran, and to a lesser extent to Zeke Darwin. I say a lesser extent because from what I gather he has actually been very good when it comes to bringing the concerns of scientists to Colossal. I genuinely have a lot of respect for you, Zeke. But to everyone who is working as a science communicator for Colossal, the company you are working to promote is actively attacking and mocking the scientific community on Twitter. And it is demonstrably lying about its own findings in its social media and videos. Standing with this company is standing with people who are at the very least sympathetic to the far right, whilst developing technology that has the potential to be used for eugenics purposes. Standing with this company is standing with people who use their platform to uplift anti-queer voices in the midst of America conducting an active genocide against trans people. Standing with this company is standing with a company who uplifts and shares anti-conservation and anti-climate action voices, whilst contrasting the biodiversity and climate crises in their videos and saying that the biodiversity crisis is the one of the two that we should be taking seriously. If Colossal is such a reputable science company, why is it making memes to attack scientists? In short, if you continue to stand with this company, you are not standing for science. You are selling out to the highest bidder.